The Acts of the Apostles, with its fascinating stories of the early church in Palestine, becomes increasingly concerned with the dramatic experiences of St. Paul and his journeys into Asia Minor, and eventually to Rome. Those of us who read the New Testament are perhaps reasonably familiar with that part of the story. Much less known is the story of the close friends and relatives of Jesus himself and their own journeys much further into the West. The story that follows has to be told sometimes as fact, but more often than not as the clear voice of tradition. Disraeli once said that tradition can be neither made nor destroyed, and a modern writer has suggested that the silences of history correspond with the voices of tradition. This film is based on many such voices and is inspired largely by the painstaking work of Professor J.W. Taylor in the early years of this century. He made a scholarly and exhaustive study of the movements of first-century Christianity from Palestine to Provence in southern France, and then northwards to Britain. One could say, however, that the origin of all this activity goes back to the beginning of time. Nearly 2,000 years ago, there was one who said, "Ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and in Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth." The fires of religious and political intolerance took on fresh force from that moment. The year was AD 30. The person was the Jesus of history. His crucifixion was accompanied by the most extraordinary events. An earthquake, a great supernatural darkness, and other strange experiences reported by many in the city, and as reported later, a rent in the veil of the temple from top to bottom. All these things made a dramatic impact on those staying in the city. A rapidly growing number of priests and people now accepted Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah or Christ, and were called quite simply followers of the way. Opposition grew fast, and a small band of his friends and relatives were soon hounded out of the city. Another reason for their departure could well have been to avoid the publicity and curiosity of those who knew or discovered that this group, which had its center in the Bethany home of Martha, Mary Magdalene, and their brother Lazarus, were among Jesus' closest friends. Contrary to generally held belief, This group was composed not of poor peasant folk, but included people of noble birth who were comfortably well off or even rich in land and property. So, leaving much-loved Bethany and the Mount of Olives behind them, and travelling probably by night, they fled to Caesarea, where Philip the Evangelist, of New Testament fame, lived with his 4 daughters. The town was not far from modern Haifa. Here was relative peace, away from Jerusalem, where one Saul was busily flogging and putting into prison every Christian he could find. Haifa, perhaps the largest port in the eastern Mediterranean, has taken the place of Caesarea, which in its day was one of the 3 great trading centers in the Middle East. Back in Jerusalem, expectancy, fear, excitement, and uncertainty filled the air. The apostles and other followers of the way had to move about with great discretion. The Sanhedrin, the religious establishment of the day, was determined to stamp out this new heretical belief and the undeniable evidence of supernatural power. The Bethany group had become the focus of the Sanhedrin's enmity very soon after they had contrived the murder of Stephen, one of the leading witnesses and exponents of the new way. But Lazarus was equally dangerous. He was the one that Jesus had brought back to life after he'd been dead for 4 days. And so the Bethany group and other disciples, led by a man of considerable distinction in both the Roman and Jewish world of Palestine, one Joseph of Arimathea, left the country by boat in some haste. The old Vatican record says, "In a ship without oars or sails, in the year AD 35. And although they were now homeless refugees, they had in Joseph a man who knew his way about the world. Many of the other followers of the way had dispersed abroad, some to Antioch in Syria, others to the many Greek and Jewish communities around the shores of the Mediterranean. Cyprus, where Lazarus is commemorated. Crete, where there is a church dedicated to the memory of Titus, also of New Testament fame, and even the island of Corfu, which has an old tradition that Jason and Sosipater, St. Paul's kinsmen, brought Christianity to the island in the 1st century. The church which is dedicated to them was built in the 12th century. In Corfu town, icons can be seen by tourists, which preserve their memory. They are shown on either side of 3 other characters who are closely associated with our own islands. 2 were natives of our shores, the Empress Helena and her son Constantine the Great, and the 3rd is St. George of Lydda, our patron saint, born in the lovely Sharon Valley in Palestine. This jewel of the Greek islands was probably too far north for Joseph to visit, and so he brought his precious cargo, Jesus' closest friends and relatives, to Marseille, bypassing Rome in spite of the many friends he would have there, as he wouldn't want to risk further conflict with authority. However, he may well have put in to a few of the smaller ports to provision his ship along the old Phoenician trading route, and, as the old Vatican record states, they finally arrived at Marseille. In St. Stephen's Church, Bristol, there is a statue of Joseph of Arimathea, who is described as a rich man in the Gospels. He became rich, tradition says, by trading in tin, lead and copper with the far west, but chiefly with what was known in those days as the Britannic Isles. Although he was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin in Palestine, he also held office under the Romans and was what they called a decurio, a kind of minister for mines, because of his responsibility for supplying metals to the Roman authorities. Most of these he got from Britain, where, it is believed, he had extensive interests in Cornwall and knew his way there by land and sea. Indeed, it is held by one writer that he owned ships as well as shares in Cornish tin, which would explain his wealth. That there was a tin trade between Cornwall and the Middle East is supported by the fact that in Truro Museum there is a heavy ingot of tin, dredged up from the bottom of Falmouth Harbour, and is dated around 60 AD, while Joseph was alive. On arrival in Marseille, he would naturally renew his business contacts in the city. In those days, this place was the most important port in the Western Mediterranean. Marseille was a sophisticated city with centuries of history behind it, even then, 2,000 years ago. It was cosmopolitan, like many of the great trading centres of the Mediterranean. The Greeks called it Massilia, and Provence was called Provincia by the Romans. It was one of the popular watering places and holiday resorts of the rich. At this time, Jews, Greeks and Romans jostled one another in the streets. It was here in Marseille that Lazarus decided to live and work, and he became the first bishop of the new Christian community for a period of 7 years after a spell in Cyprus as a missionary priest. The first century Christians often lived rough in caves or grottos, and especially when meeting together. Such a site, chosen by St. Lazarus, was a natural cave or grotto known as the original first century church or refuge of St. Lazarus. On it today stands the old abbey church of St. Victor. Built in the 4th or 5th century, it was said to have contained 2 stone blocks from the tomb of Lazarus in Bethany, and until the early years of this century there was a statue of Lazarus in the church on which was inscribed, "St. Lazarus, raised to life by Christ, who as the first apostle to the people of Marseille, honoured the crypt of this church by his ministry and death." The local priest was heard to describe Lazarus as "le premier évêque de cette ville," the first bishop of this town. The church is named after Victor, a Roman officer who became a Christian. In the early years of the 4th century, he spent his time in house-to-house visiting, encouraging the Christians in their homes to hold fast to their faith. He was martyred for this activity in a very savage way. Strangely enough, the little village of Torbryan in Devon remembers him. There is a medieval painting of him on the beautiful 14th century wooden choir screen, which shows him with a sword in one hand and a windmill in the other. This recalls his death by being thrown between 2 millstones. Prior to this, he was warned by his superiors to renounce his faith, hauled before the tribunal, and after further threats brought before Maximian, the Western Roman Emperor, who made a special visit to the city to persecute Christians. The inevitable judgment followed, but while in jail, before he died, he was instrumental, like Paul, in converting his jailers. As a grim forewarning of the then future Roman persecution of Christians in Provence, the story is told on part of a tomb slab found near St. Victor's Church in the 19th century of a Christian family massacred for their faith as early as 70 or 80 AD. This is the town of Autun in central France. It is on one of the natural trade routes to the north of the Rhone Valley and was once a Roman garrison town of considerable importance. In 1079, Gérard de Roussillon brought the relics of Lazarus here from Marseille. Later on, a graceful cathedral was built to house them, called La Cathédrale de Saint-Lazare. Further evidence of the connection between Lazarus and Autun, though the town is a long way from Marseille, is the name of the town square, known today as Le Champ de Mars, but originally it was called the Camp of Lazarus. On the 24th of May each year, the tiny coastal town of Les Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer, lying beside one of the mouths of the River Rhône, is besieged by thousands of gypsies and travelling folk from all over Europe who come to do honour, with feasting, dancing and religious services, to their patron saint, Sarah. Sarah was by tradition an Ethiopian servant girl, handmaid to two of the occupants of Joseph's ship, Mary Cleopas, sister of the Virgin Mary, and Mary Salome, mother of James and John. The story goes that Sarah was so devoted to her mistresses that as the ship left the sandy beaches of Caesarea, and feeling unable to bear such a parting, she dashed through the surf and was hauled on board, thereafter to serve the two Marys until her dying day. The word gypsy comes from Egypto or Gyppo, a slang word for an inhabitant of Egypt. Thus Sarah, from adjoining Ethiopia, might well be the connecting link between the gypsies and their patron saint. The little town of Les Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer is set amongst the sand dunes on the southern edge of the Camargue Nature Reserve. The name itself suggests an approach from the sea, and to commemorate the arrival of the two Marys and their maid Sarah, a little monument has been built at the west end of the beach, an anchor and cross motif in bronze. One is tempted to ask whether the old Christmas carol, "I saw three ships come sailing by," may not refer to this event, as it is widely held that many famous nursery rhymes and jingles are based on historical happenings. One version of the carol, "I saw three ships," reads, "And who do you think was in those ships but Joseph and his fair lady? Not, it is believed, Joseph the carpenter of Nazareth, but Joseph of Arimathea and the Virgin Mary." The church at Les Saintes-Maries, originally called St. Mary of the Boat, looks more like a fortress than a place of worship, and is dedicated to the memory of Mary Cleopas, or Mary Jacobe, as she is known locally, and Mary Salome. It dates back to the 8th century, and at the time of the festival is packed to overflowing with a very colourful but very reverent and respectful congregation of gypsies who have come to light candles and say prayers to these two Marys and to their maid Sarah, the patron saint of the gypsies. Sarah has a chapel all to herself, and the two Marys are remembered in many ways, notably by a colourful representation of them in a boat. The effigies of the two Marys are escorted some 50 yards into the warm and shallow Mediterranean by the famous horsemen, the cowboys of the Camargue, and are then carried ashore unto the church in procession. Hands reaching out to touch the effigies in the fervent belief that all ills will be cured. In the last century, the French poet Mistral names in his poem Mireio some of the occupants of the ship without oars or sails. There was Martha and Mary Magdalene, the sisters of Lazarus, Lazarus, Marcella, maid to Martha and Mary, Mary Cleopas, Mary Salome, and Sarah, their maid, Maximin, Trophimus, Parmenas, Restitutus, Martial, Saturninus, Eutropius, and in charge of the party, Joseph of Arimathea. Most of them are unknown to us, except perhaps those whose names appear in the New Testament. But a possible confirmation of their arrival in Provence comes from a rather unexpected source. The Jewish Encyclopedia, quoting a writer in the last century, states that the first Jewish settlers at Arles, on the Rhone, arrived in Provence in 3 vessels, which had been deserted by their captains, which suggests quite a company of travellers, navigating without professional crews. They might well have come ashore at a quayside such as this, on the Arles waterfront. Of all the places touched by the followers of the Way as the new light moved further north into Gaul, Arles is perhaps the most important, mainly because of the life and work of a man called Trophimus, one of those who accompanied Joseph. Trophimus was the one most likely to be at home and at ease in the cultured and professional circles of the Roman world. He was the intellectual Greek from Ephesus, friend and companion of St. Paul, who had journeyed with him on many occasions. He would have been welcome in any of the Greek communities around the Mediterranean, but especially so at Marseille, with its centuries-old Greek traditions and culture. Trophimus settled at Arles, where he would be relatively nearer the other members of the Bethany group, and he is especially remembered in the beautiful cathedral called after his name in Arles town square. And in the cloisters which commemorate in statue form all the leading members of the early church. For part of his life in Provence, Trophimus lived on a rocky eminence near Arles, where now stands the imposing abbey of Montmajour. In the peace and quiet of the ancient burial ground of Les Aliscons, away from the everlasting roar of the Marseille-Nice main road, are rows of pre-Christian stone tombs. This was originally a pagan burial ground, and the story goes that Trophimus, walking by himself one night amongst the tombs, and much troubled by the, to us, seemingly unimportant problem of having his Christian friends buried in a pagan cemetery, had a vision of Christ kneeling at prayer amongst the tombs. As a result of this experience, Les Aliscons became hallowed ground. This charming old legend became known as the Genouillade, or the Kneeling Saviour, but the word Aliscons suggests a fascinating link with the Champs-Élysées in Paris and the Elysian fields of Greek mythology, taking us back to the classical Greece of the 5th century BC, or even much earlier. To commemorate this experience in the life of Trophimus, a tiny chapel was built called the Chapelle de la Genouillade, past which now thunders the main road traffic. It was at Arles, once the capital of Provence, that in the year 314, Constantine the Great, son of the Empress Helena, convened the first European Council soon after he had become absolute ruler of the Roman Empire. Greatly influenced by his saintly mother and brother-in-arms, St. George of Lydda, he revoked all the previous edicts which had resulted in the massacre of thousands of Christians, not only in these islands, but also on the continent of Europe. At this Council of Arles, 3 British archbishops were in attendance, who were themselves responsible for 28 bishops and their dioceses. It is perhaps because of its ancient Christian traditions and the vitality of the first Christian groups at Arles in the early days, under the guidance of Trophimus, that this place was chosen for such an important conference of Christian leaders. 1,000 years later, those early traditions were remembered at the Council of Constance, where it was officially established that the British bishops should take their position as representatives of the senior Church of Christendom, as it was formed by Joseph of Arimathea immediately after the Passion of Christ. Martha, the traditionally much older and busy hostess at the old home of the Bethany family, settled by the river Rhone at Tarascon, which takes its name from the word Tarasque, meaning monster. In June, an effigy of Martha is carried in procession round the town, finishing at the church for a commemorative service of thanksgiving for this intelligent and practical woman who, it is believed, rid the area of this beast in some miraculous way remembered ever since. Crocodiles were not unknown at the time, and may have caused great panic, but the truth may lie deeper, and the monster may well represent some evil such as demon possession or a local disease or epidemic from which Martha rescued the village folk in a great work of healing. In any event, the people of Tarascon always remembered Martha's great work, commemorating in a symbolic way the conquest of this sinister creature by parading its effigy through the streets every year. Martha was interred beneath the crypt of the church. In this impregnable and imposing-looking castle beside the Rhone lived King René in the 15th century, and it was he who discovered the relics of St. Martha, which he reinterred beneath the church. Although the story of Martha dominates the town, tradition also records that Martha, accompanied by Marcella, the family maidservant, was devoted to Parmenas, one of the 7 men of good report mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Martha is also remembered at Avignon, the city of the popes. According to Rabanus Maurus, Archbishop of Mayence, who lived in the 9th century, Avignon was the place chosen by Parmenas and a number of others, mentioned by name, as their place of work and service. Mary Magdalene, Martha's younger sister, is one of the most well-known names in the New Testament. She was the first person, a woman, to see Christ alive after his resurrection, the first person to carry news that has dominated the last 2,000 years of history. The gay little rich girl of royal blood whose life was completely changed when she met Jesus, probably at Capernaum, not far from her villa at Magdala, now called Migdal, on the quiet and charming western shore of the Lake of Galilee. After accompanying Joseph with the others to Provence, she spent her later years in La Sainte-Baume in eastern Provence, making her home in a large grotto beneath the massive overhanging cliff of the mountain range known as La Chaîne de la Sainte-Baume. Mary is also remembered in some of the local place names, Magdala Estate and Bethany Farm. La Sainte-Baume has been a place of pilgrimage for centuries. A great many popes and kings as recent as John the 22nd and Louis the 14th, as well as prelates and people from many countries, have visited this shrine throughout the Christian era. In the famous Cathedral of Chartres, there is a beautiful stained glass window dedicated to Mary's memory. The many scenes depicted tell the story of her life, including her arrival by boat in Provence, and the current guidebook gives much detail. A few miles from Sainte-Baume is the little town of Saint-Maximin, named after one of those who accompanied Joseph on his westward voyage by boat. Tradition says that he was a leading disciple, and the same young man who had great possessions, and who at the first went away sorrowful from Jesus, as he could not bring himself to let go of his worldly goods. Tradition also records that Mary Magdalene was devoted to him and wanted to live near enough to help him in his work of teaching. Later he became the Bishop of Aix-en-Provence. On the great wooden doors of the church of Saint-Maximin is a modern wood carving representing Mary Magdalene in a scene depicting Golgotha, the place of the skull. Mary's burial place is unknown, but inside the church of Saint-Maximin, in the crypt, are two very ornate stone tombs. That on the right, traditionally, the tomb of Sidonius, another occupant of the boat, and on the left, that of Maximin himself. Further north, up the Rhone valley, is Orange, associated with another member of Joseph's party, one Eutropius. It was here that he decided to settle and work as a missionary priest. Orange is famous for its Roman remains, including one well known to motorists, the Triumphal Arch, another lasting monument and reminder of the might of Roman arms, erected after one of Caesar's victories in the 1st century BC. Further up the Rhone valley, a few miles north of Orange, is the little village of Saint-Restitut. One of the Provençal traditions is that it is named after Restitutus, the man born blind, whose story is told in St. John's Gospel. The Latin word restitutus means restoration, and the New Testament records that the Jewish authorities were furious when he said that Jesus had restored his sight. This miracle is shown in the east window. The same tradition associates him with the more important town of Saint-Paul-Trois-Châteaux, where he is said to have been its first bishop or priest. Another tradition associates him with Aix-en-Provence, where it is said that he took charge of the church after the death of Maximin. Just as today the main road and railway follow the course of the Rhone to the north, so Joseph and his companions would arrive at Vienne and Lyon, which were to become in later centuries two of the earliest strongholds of primitive Christianity. In the intervening years, however, they were to set the stage for scenes of bestial cruelty and deadly drama. Vienne, a beautiful if not elegant little town, has associations and connections going back to the 2nd century BC, but in the same period as that of our northbound travellers, the ill-famed Archelaus, brother of the equally notorious Herod of the Gospels, was banished to this place. Even stranger to relate, Pontius Pilate and his wife Claudia Procula retired here after the crucifixion of Christ, and tradition says that he later committed suicide, here in retirement. In the 2nd century AD, both Vienne and Lyon were involved in the persecution and massacre of thousands of Christians. Amongst these were two from Lyon who are specially remembered, and whose tragic end is recalled in this enormous bas-relief on the side of the handsome church of Notre-Dame de Fourvière on the hilltop overlooking Lyon. These two were Pothinus and Blandina. Pothinus was the leader of the Christian community in Lyon, and at the time of his martyrdom was a very old man, believed to have been 90 years old. His age, however, did not save him from Roman brutality, and he was confined in a small cell in which he could neither sit nor stand, and after 3 days of this torment he died. Blandina, a woman, suffered unspeakable tortures in the Roman arena before her death. But both Pothinus and Blandina gave the deepest encouragement to their fellow Christians by the way they bore their sufferings. The year was AD 177. Here in the arena at Lyon, the iron heel of the Roman Empire bit deep in merciless extermination. But it failed to stamp out the rapidly growing Christian faith, though many hundreds were put to death. The Romans were great colonizers, organizers, builders, and engineers. They built this magnificent aqueduct, the Pont du Gard, and many other great monuments designed to last for all time and remind people of the might of Roman arms. This certainly was achieved, but Roman brutality is more often forgotten. In the center of Lyon is the twin-spired church of Saint-Nizier. An inscription on a wall plaque refers to St. Pothinus as the disciple of Polycarp, who brought the Christian faith from the shores of the East in the 2nd century. Polycarp was himself the disciple of John, the writer of the 4th Gospel, a very real link with the Galilean hills. The guidebook indicates the position of a statue of St. Pothinus in the church, but the eye is caught by the statue of an unnamed figure further down the nave in a modern war memorial. It represents victory, and is perhaps also a memorial to another unknown soldier in a bygone age who died for his faith. The murder of Christians was savage and continuous at this time, and persecution went on until the time of Constantine the Great. Is this perhaps a moment to pause and ask ourselves how strong the faith was of these early Christians, not only here in Provence, but also in Rome's Colosseum at the time of the infamous Nero, and even in Britain? Here were men and women who gave their blood not for their country, which was then under the heel of Rome, but for their faith, which they regarded as the source and center of true freedom, and the hope of a new society ruled by right and not by might. In Rome, where the underground catacombs run for miles, thousands upon thousands of Christians were buried after suffering martyrdom for their faith. Perhaps the old saying is true: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, that body of Christians which has influenced, if not dominated, the history of the world for nearly 2,000 years. Further to the west is the picturesque little village of Rocamadour, built into the side of the cliffs near the river Dordogne. It may easily have been on the route of the old traders when travelling overland from Marseille or Narbonne to Morlaix or Vannes in Brittany. There is an empty tomb in this little village which has been the focal point of the most ancient of all the French pilgrimages, the tomb of the odd man out, Zacchaeus, for he is not mentioned as one of the occupants of the refugee boat without oars or sails. You may remember Zacchaeus of New Testament fame as a tax collector, or publican as he is called. His eagerness to see Jesus when he came to Jericho knew no bounds, so being of small stature he selected a perfect viewpoint up a sycamore tree. Imagine his surprise and embarrassment when Jesus looked up and greeted him by name. He became a devoted follower and chose this place high up on a hillside, where he gathered round him many other followers. Zacchaeus is known in Rocamadour both by his New Testament name and by his other name, Saint Amador. Either because he loved the rocky escarpment on which he lived, or because he loved the local people in the area, he was given the name Amador, from the Latin word meaning love. King Henry II made 2 pilgrimages to Rocamadour, and the great Roland de Roncesvalles laid up his sword here. After many centuries, Zacchaeus' body was removed from the tomb and burnt by the Huguenots. But although the charred remains were said to have been collected by devoted villagers, today the crypt is empty. Further north we find at Limoges a staging post on the old Phoenician trade route, famous over 1,000 years for its enamels, an ancient tradition concerning St. Martial, yet another named occupant of the refugee boat. For not only is Martial remembered here, but also his mother and father, Elizabeth and Marcellus. From Limoges, one of the old trade routes lay northwest to Morlaix on the coast of Brittany, which is at the head of a long sea inlet, providing a sheltered transfer point for goods brought by pack animals overland from the Rhone. This trade route between the eastern Mediterranean and the Britannic Islands existed long before the coming of these early disciples to Provence. From Morlaix, cargoes would be shipped across the Channel to southwest Britain, referred to by Herodotus as the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands. Here at Morlaix we find a tradition that one Drenalus, a disciple of Joseph of Arimathea, preached the gospel in the year AD 72. Thus, in the 1st century, Christianity followed the trade route, a pattern repeated many times over in later centuries when explorers, traders and colonizers were followed by men and women bringing the Bible and new hope to many lands. And so, fulfilling the original commission of his old friend St. Philip, Joseph and his 11 companions crossed the Channel to Cornwall, a journey which then took about 4 days, but which today takes only a few hours by the Plymouth-Roscoff ferry. From Cornwall they went to Glastonbury to found the first above-ground Christian church in Britain in the year AD 36. But that's another story. This eventful journey began by sea and ended by sea. We have traced Joseph's path overland, a journey he must have known well enough, which tradition records as the ancient tin trade route across France. Some of his companions we know by name, but all tend to be names associated only with Palestine or the New Testament, remaining static and remote, rather like stained glass windows in ancient churches, distant memories of people who never stepped out of the Bible into history. But these are real people, and in our journey we have seen many places where they are remembered. We have seen records, the validity of which is sometimes gossamer thin by modern standards, but all tell a strangely coherent and consistent story of a light that inspired these men and women and many others to face with courage the possibility of persecution, death, or the privations of long journeys by land and sea. The Phoenicians travelled over many seas in search of trade for their own ends, or as one might say, for their own commercial advantage. Christians down the centuries have also travelled great distances because of a faith that made all the difference to their lives. They did it to bear witness to an inner experience that could in the end transform the world. If the story told in this film is not true, why should there be such a concentration of traditions, found only in France and the west of England, that have lasted nearly 2,000 years? The light that shone so brightly at Glastonbury in the 1st century spread to Ireland and then to Scotland through Iona, to the north of England through Lindisfarne, and then far and wide throughout the earth. At the beginning of this story, we referred to a statement made by Jesus at the end of his mission on earth. It was said to those followers who were to carry his words throughout the world to every nation, "Ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and in Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth." His words were to light the path of everyone that followed him, to be a torch, a beacon light for the church, a light in which we begin to see the great drama and pattern of history. This is surely why Christ referred to himself as the light of the world.